Morning, everyone. I know we have a lot of people who are going to be slowly trickling in here, so I'll give it a few more, like about a minute more, before we get started. We're going to get started right away because our lawmakers who are joining us this morning have a hard stop at 9:30, and so we really want to maximize our time with them. But I am reaching out to one more who's supposed to be joining us. Well, we will get started. So thank you everyone for joining Minnesota Housing Partnership this morning. It is an exciting time of year in the policy world, especially at the state level and also right now at the federal level. Today's focus is on what's happening at the Minnesota State Legislature. We're joined this morning by Senators Lindsey Port, Representative Spencer Igo, and Representative Michael Howard. They're all chairs of the Housing Committee, and our focus this morning is about updates from the Housing Committee, while other jurisdictions like the tax committee will also have some housing provisions in them. We don't have those bills yet. We don't have the capital investment bill yet. So we're going to really focus on what is in the housing bill. We're going to start this morning with our co-chairs talking about what's going on. And then I'm going to give a more detailed overview about specific numbers in the bills, as well as some policies that are in each of the bills. Like I said, for our chairs have a hard stop at 9:30, and so we're going to try and maximize our time with them and go over the details after they leave us. So first, just want to thank our chairs for joining us this morning. I think Howard has yet to log in, but that's okay. We have Senators Port and Representative Igo who are here with us this morning. So just thank you for joining us, and we'll get into it. Both of you have put together your housing omnibus bills. The Senate passed its housing omnibus bill off of the Senate floor on Tuesday. I think it was Tuesday. And the House housing bill is in Ways and Means, and it's scheduled for the floor. We're hearing next Tuesday. And so then what comes next is conference committee, in which the two will have to come together and negotiate. And so high level, real quick, is that the Senate has a budget target of 3 million this biennium and 1 million in the next biennium, and the House has a $75 million one-time target for this biennium, and then it also includes 100 million in housing infrastructure bonds. So the House and Senate are worlds apart. First, I'll just pass it over. We'll start with Senator Port, and then we'll go to Representative Igo just to talk really briefly about where things are in your housing priorities as you are going into this next phase of the legislative session.
Thanks, Libby. Hi, everyone. Really nice to see you. Yeah, as Libby said, in numbers, I would say our bills are worlds apart, 3 million versus 75 million. Obviously, I really like the House's target, and I hope we end up closer to that than closer to the Senate target. But I will also say that I think our priorities are really pretty aligned. We put in the Senate most of the money into FHPAP for, emergency rental assistance, keeping people stable. At this moment, to me, the most necessary word is stability, especially with the sort of unknown chaos of the federal government. We wanted to make sure that we were investing in the program that we know is most effective for just keeping people in their housing in those moments of crisis. We also added money into the Greater Minnesota Infrastructure Grant Program because we know that if we want growth to happen in Greater Minnesota, infrastructure is really the biggest roadblock in the way of that. And so helping to sort of bridge that gap, it's not a lot of money, but we did build it into the tails so that it is an ongoing program, even at 500,000. It builds it in so that we can come back each year and hopefully adjust that investment. The other place that we put money in the Senate is in the community-based down payment for first-generation home buyers. We've seen that program be really successful. It's really connected to community and really flexible, allowing folks to use, any mortgage products that fit their needs. And continuing to close this homeownership gap is just always a critical piece for us. I think that's sort of the overview of what we did with our money. There's just not that much in the Senate. But happy to be here with you. Looking forward to answering any questions you have. And again, I think just highlighting that I think we're the most functional committees across two chambers. We work really well together. And I know Spencer is going to talk next about what the House has. But I actually think like our conference committee will be really focused on a lot of the same things and will work well together, figuring out how to, keep Minnesotans stable and help as many people as possible ensure that they have that stable housing that's necessary.
Thank you, Senator Port. That's always fabulous to hear that you are functioning well and that we can anticipate more of the same in this next legislative session, that the House Housing Committee is working well together. So thank you. I'll turn it over to Representative Igo to just give a brief overview of where you're at and your priorities as you go into this next phase of session.
Yeah, well, thank you, Libby, and thank you everyone for giving us some time this morning to talk about our bills and where we're at today. I just got to start. I got to echo what Senator Port was talking about. I mean, the two housing committees in the House and the Senate have been working together incredibly well. I think we really have set the gold standard on how you can work together and compromise things and find solutions. Like we started meeting in December to start talking about priorities, and that's why we have such strong relationships and are working on good policy. Senator Port went over her bill. It's not much different than Chair Howard and I's. We just had that bigger target that we were, fortunate to have, and hopefully we can arm wrestle for when we get conference to keep that higher amount. But we prioritize some of the similar things. What we decided to do in the House is we kept the base budget for housing intact. And then we looked at our budget target and said, okay, what can we do to invest and make things better? So our big thing is we focused on brick and mortar and FHPAP. So Chair Howard and I both recognize that, yes, we need to be making sure to keep people in homes. It is agreed upon across the board. FHPAP is the program that is the best served to do that. So we agreed, okay, we'll put $30 million in FHPAP. And then we were able to put about $45 million into brick and mortar infrastructure type grant programs. So 20 million of that is for Greater Minnesota infrastructure. 10 million of that's for Greater Minnesota workforce. 2 million is going to be for manufactured homes. We also put more money into the Housing Challenge program and $3 million into workforce and affordable home ownership programs. So our idea was there is that let's get those programs out to actually start building out the homes that we need. And then I should mention, because it's been brought up a lot in the last week, Chair Howard and I also did a handshake amendment on our bill to advise Minnesota Housing Agency to, as they're going for these grants, there's going to be a couple new lines of scoring in there for cities that are going to be looking at and instituting new zoning practices that are working across the country that incentivize new homes to be built. They'll score a little better on these grants and hopefully would, reward cities that are going that way. And that's been a large conversation. Everyone in this chat probably knows about, land use and zoning has been a huge conversation. And this was Chair Howard and I's way of saying, all right, here's the carrot that says if you start instituting these things, you're going to get that extra point that might help you get the grant that's needed to do the infrastructure in your community. But that really, for the most part, is our bill. Policy-wise, on the House side, there was very little. We did a lot of just the bipartisan policy that we both agreed on, and then we moved on. One of the things it feels small, but it's kind of a fun thing that we got done is we're having Minnesota Housing put a tab and on their website that's going to give all the different handbooks for landlords and tenants. The state's invested tens of thousands of dollars into resources for people across the state, and they're really hard to find. So Chair Howard and I both agreed, let's tell the agency to make that stuff readily available so people have the tools in front of them. But that's really where our bill's at. We also have $100 million in HIBs in our bill, which is really exciting in a lot of ways. We were able to factor in the debt service for that as well into our bill. So we're both feeling pretty happy about where we're at. And I'll just echo Senator Port again. I think when we get to conference, it's going to be a very good conference committee.
Well, thank you for that. And I know Chair Howard is trying to get in. And so he will be joining us hopefully momentarily. Got to get him the link directly. But so you've touched on a few things. I want to stay focused on the budget before moving into some of the policy. I think a lot of us on the call who track what's going on with the Minnesota budget were excited to see the $75 million that the House is putting towards housing. That came as a surprise for a lot of us. We want to make sure that we can do everything in our power to support the House's position to make sure that that target remains strong. Realistically, and sort of as you're thinking about the next phase and global negotiations for a target between the House and the Senate is much farther away than the House, and the governor is at 0. A combination of, if that target reduces in size, are we going to see similar priorities in the House and the Senate? I mean, Senator Port, if you had a $75 million target, does the House bill look something like you would have put together? Or are there things that you would look to do if there is more money available? And I guess Representative Igo, as if there's less money, does the way that you're thinking about that split between stabilizing households and brick and mortar, does that change a little bit for you? I'll let you go first, Spencer.
I think the split right now, the thing is, if we look at the base budget does a lot in stabilization already. So I guess my position was more like, let's make sure we're continuing to expand housing at the same time. Again, I think we are really going to fight really hard to keep that $75 million target. Just because, and I think everyone on this call knows, like, housing is a top 3 issue for every single Minnesotan. And the fact that the housing budget eats up such a small portion as it is, the $75 million target we got should be something that is universally agreed on that we can keep. But if we do have to bring it down, I think we do need to make sure to balance stabilization with brick and mortar. And based on what that number is, but based on where I want to be. But I think where we're at in the House is a really strong position that shows support for both.
And I'll just jump in, Libby, and say, as if ours increases, as it hopefully does, really I don't disagree with anything that Rep. Igo just said. I think one of the places where I would probably have a little difference is that down payment assistance. I totally agree that we need to invest more, but also if people can't get into those homes, then it's not working. Particularly folks who we know have been, blocked and disproportionately unable to buy homes over years. So I think that down payment assistance program for first-gen buyers would be really critical. And the other piece I'll say is that I really hope wherever we end up with numbers that we are able to keep housing infrastructure bonds that the House has. I think those are so critical for planning out, for the stability of just the industry in general, and being able to have those long-term plans of investment. So I'm really hopeful that we will be able to keep those HIBs that the House has.
Thank you. And I want to welcome Representative Howard, and my apologies for making it confusing for you to enter. So I want to give Representative Howard a moment just to introduce himself. And Spencer, Representative Igo gave an overview of the House budget, and I'll be going in more in detail, so no need to really touch on that. But really, as you're thinking about this next step, this next phase in the legislative session, your priorities moving into conference committee and negotiations amongst the Senate and the governor's office in terms of what you want to see come out of this session.
Yeah, thanks everybody for the opportunity, and sorry to be late. Mike Howard, co-chair of our housing committee in the Minnesota House. We're in a fortunate position to have bipartisan leaders who are really pulling in the same direction and see the need to invest across the continuum of our housing needs and the reality that we're in this really crisis point moment. Whether it and I think about two big priorities for me when I think about the moment we're in. One is that we're, January, February were some of the highest months for eviction rates we've seen ever in the state. And over the last budget, we provided significant investments in emergency rental assistance to keep people stably housed. And even in the most optimistic version, even with our stronger House budget, some of those resources are going to take a pretty big dip. And that gives me such concern heading into the summer and fall when you look at the economic challenges facing Minnesotans and the federal government uncertainty. It's such a high priority for us to try to prevent homelessness and keep people safe and stable. At the same time, we have one of the country's worst housing shortages. And every session, every day, every month that we're not taking bold steps to build more homes, both in terms of public investment and unlocking private investment from a policy reform perspective, we are digging a deeper hole that's going to be harder for us to ever climb out of. And so we need to do both of those things, build more homes and keep folks stable. And what I'd say about that is from a budget perspective, it's already really hard to do that even within our much stronger House budget target. And it is vital, and I think we all have a role to push our leaders, and in particular the governor, to stand up for housing. The governor's budget actually is a cut to housing. The governor's budget includes no money in HIBs and actually takes away permanent investments in housing. And it's really important that all of us send a clear message that that's not going to cut it. That if we do that, people's lives will be harmed. We will have higher homelessness than we've ever had in this state if we leave the session without making investments. And generally speaking, the housing target in the House is stronger than other budget areas, but I really think we should challenge ourselves to not think two-dimensionally about this and this housing target is at this level and this budget area is at this level. We have to remind ourselves that we start from a place of the MHFA budget being 0.25% of our general fund budget. So yes, there's a one-time $75 million investment, and yes, there's $7 million in the tails for HIBs, but these are drops in the bucket compared to our overall state budget. And I think it would be cruel if we were to, in budget negotiations, go after such small pots of resources in the whole scale of things when you consider what Minnesotans are up against and what our state is up against with our housing crisis. And so that's a long way to say that we'll be fighting hard, and we all need to be fighting hard for the House position, because literally the livelihood and homes of Minnesotans are at stake in that fight.
Thank you for that call to action, Representative Howard. Representative Howard mentioned something about evictions and the status of evictions in the state of Minnesota right now. And so I want to ask a question about efforts in the Senate. So there's been a lot of talk about housing stability, both for individuals who are impacted by financial crisis. And we've talked about Family Homeless Prevention and Assistance Program to really help and intervene to keep those families stably housed. And keep homeowners in their homes. We've also talked a lot of session about the state of the affordable housing industry as a whole, and there's a lot of financial uncertainty for many housing providers. So two things that the Senate, one they tried to do and one that it did pass. So Senator Port, you had introduced an amendment to, should housing choice vouchers be cut by the federal government, it would automatically trigger a 3-month eviction moratorium so that the state could come back to special session to figure out what to do for those many, but proportionately few households could navigate what to do next in terms of losing their housing assistance. That did not pass, mostly because it wasn't considered germane, so you weren't able to have the discussion. So I am curious, and this is a question for all of you, would there be a path forward for a temporary eviction moratorium should there be cuts at the federal level that would potentially displace residents? The other question I have is around an amendment that did pass in the Senate. Some on this call will support that amendment to modify the ways in which rent increases are calculated for low-income housing tax credit projects. Currently these are rent-controlled projects as is, and what the Senate did was modify the calculation. Some on this call will support that as a way to stabilize renters. Some on this call, including Minnesota Housing Partnership, do not support the amendment that was passed because it makes it harder for housing providers to stabilize their portfolios and provide dignified housing, as well as we think about production and other uncertainties. It adds an additional layer of uncertainty. So I'm curious, both of these, is there a path forward? I guess first that I'll go to Senator Port. These were things that have occurred in the Senate, and then I'd ask the representatives to respond. And do you see similar amendments happening in the House as you debate on the floor next week? And would there be support in the overall omnibus bill?
Thanks for the question, Libby. I'll take the first one first, talking about that eviction moratorium should Section 8, get canceled, or they've laid off half of the federal workers at this point. If there are more layoffs and just the program stops working and we stop being able to get those funds to Minnesota. I apologize if you notice me looking away. It's because I'm watching the Finance Committee right now in the Senate, where the Judiciary Bill is, which is actually the portion of law that this is germane to. There's going to be another attempt to add that provision into the Judiciary Bill this morning. I do expect it to get added onto the Judiciary Bill. And again, it would be just a 3-month moratorium where for folks who, have those housing choice vouchers, and if the federal government stops paying them, in order for us to come back. It does also loop in some money from the 26 MHFA appropriations to backfill some of that. And then we would have to come back in as a legislature and pay that back, as well as figure out what our long-term plan is for those 32,000 Minnesota families. As far as the LIHTC change, I really love my committee. Most of the time, we get to hear a lot about people's sort of hopes and dreams and, a chance for homeownership, a chance for housing stability, how these programs work and affect them. And I will say that day when we heard from seniors in these LIHTC buildings, and we also heard from similar stories from manufactured housing, was probably the worst day I've had in my committee because it was so heartbreaking. Listening to these seniors talk about, how they're now paying upwards of 50, in some cases 72% of their income to their rent, was just, it was heartbreaking. So I do think that it's a worthy conversation to have. I'm always a little leery about putting something across the board, because I do think in this case, it is 1 or 2 bad actors. It is not an industry standard. And it is an industry that is in really tough financial positions. And I am absolutely aware of that and open to that. I think this is a starting point for us to have the conversation. And I will say, I think it's been, um, pretty hard to have this conversation, particularly on the Senate side over the last few years. It's kind of gotten blocked over and over. And so I do think that this pushes us to have the conversation and figure out, are there ways that we can balance the needs of the industry at whole with the needs of those folks, who are put in these awful positions where they're spending huge amounts of their income on rent.
So, Representatives Igo or Howard, if you want to address the question quickly, because I also want to ask a land use zoning question before you all have to hop off. But if there's something you wanted to add to Senator Port's comments, please feel free.
I'll just make a quick comment to those two questions. The first part, around the LIHTC stuff. I'm not going to be there supporting. I mean, we're working together really well. That's something that I'm just not there on. And then the moratorium, I'm also not supportive of that, just because I don't like to legislate preemptively for something we don't want to happen. I think that's a bad precedent to set. So I for that reason, I'm against that as well. I'll just say that. But we all still get along. We're all still friends.
I'll just say something briefly that's a good lead into the zoning question. First, on the eviction moratorium piece, I do think it's appropriate to try to plan for what could happen so that we're ready. But I haven't, Chair Igon and I haven't talked too much about this, but I think it's a good conversation to have. To the LIHTC piece, what I would say is I do think it's appropriate for us to really see the whole picture and try to understand policy implications. But what I totally understand where it's coming from, and it's really coming from a place of desperation that there aren't bigger systemic changes happening in our housing sector. And we heard some of those same exact stories, and where I think some of our energy really should be focused is on the structural reforms, like our land use and planning and zoning. In some ways, we're trying to create all these policy mechanisms to address symptoms of what is the core problem, which is that we don't have enough homes. And so I'll just leave it there because it's a good lead into, I think, your next question.
Yeah. So another thing that happened, well, there's been a lot of land use and zoning reform bills. The Yes to Home Coalition had a whole package, and all of you have been tremendously supportive. I don't necessarily want to get into where the status of those bills at the moment in session, because we've got a few more minutes. But I want to talk about the House's amendment because that did create some tension amongst Republicans and Democrats in the House Ways and Means Committee. This remains an issue where there's some unique coalitions, even amongst legislators. It's a nonpartisan issue for both support and opposition. But can you speak to what you're trying to do through your budget bill at this point in session, and how you see it addressing some of these systemic underlying issues and barriers to creating more housing to help address what's happening as a result of the shortage of homes? Is there's not options for people at a variety of incomes, and it's putting pressure on rents.
Yeah, I can speak to it. This is an amendment that we offered, Chair Igo and I worked together on and offered to our housing bill, and it reflects the desire that we need to keep this conversation pressing forward. And we are still working daily to see how far we can get on this issue, knowing, again, that our housing shortage is only going to worsen unless we take some level of steps to use our to reform the barriers that are preventing homes from being created. So this amendment really is frankly, a very small way that we can help move the needle. And it's reflective of something we've heard from city groups, which is like, we don't like mandates and sticks, we want carrots. And so, okay, here's a carrot approach. And it says that if if a project is getting funded through MHFA, when you go through their scoring system, if it occurs within a municipality that has taken steps to make it easier to build more homes through a set pro housing supply steps, whether it be allowing for duplexes and townhomes, allowing for much more multifamily within existing commercial, parking reform, kind of a slate of those issues, you can get a scoring boost. And so the idea here is let's incentivize development in areas where we can maximize more units and more homes. And even that has received quite a bit of pushback from city groups that are fighting tooth and nail for the status quo. What I would say is through conversations we're having, I feel really optimistic that this provision will be passed out of the House. And hopefully it helps move the needle forward and helps us keep having conversations this session about how do we do the big thing, because we still need to do the big thing to make sure that in the state of Minnesota, it's much more easy to build the kinds of homes that we aren't right now.
Here I go. Do you want to add to that, or is that...
My co-chair there did a really good job of kind of going over it. I mean, this land use and zoning conversation can't go away. The way I talk about it with people is you have some of the most polarizing people in politics right now on both sides of the aisle saying we need to do this. You have the reddest states in the nation doing this. You have the bluest states in the nation doing land use and zoning reform. This is a nonpartisan way to lift up all of our communities and start building the diverse types of housing that are affordable, that create stability in our communities. And we just got to keep pushing and educating the legislature, but also people outside the legislature, educating our mayors, educating our councilors, our counties, our neighbors on really what we're trying to do. And I think once you have that 15-minute conversation, people realize, oh, wow, this could really change what it looks like to buy a home in Minnesota. And that's what we all need to be doing.
Senator Port, quickly, do you think that this is an amendment that you would be well received in the Senate?
I do. I think we've been looking for, different ways to add carrots, as Mike said, because, a few years ago, we added the municipalities get some of the sales tax money that we raised for housing, which to us really felt like that carrot that folks were asking for, investing money consistently long-term into municipalities. But I think this is another great way to incentivize this kind of behavior as we continue to move towards, real reform at the state level.
Great. Well, I want to respect all of your time. I believe some of you, if not all of you, have a meeting to go to. And so just want to say thank you so much. And we look forward to continuing to work with you as you navigate these next 3 weeks of session. Hopefully there won't be a special session, but we look forward to an end of session update at some point with all of you, and continue the good fight. And we were all behind the House in fighting for that 75 million, 100 million in HIBs. So however, all of us on this call can be of use. And I think we heard the call to action, and MHB has an action alert out. So if you haven't made that phone call to the governor, please make it. If you have made your phone call to the governor, please call Speaker Demuth and call Hortman and Majority Leader Murphy to tell leadership that they need to deliver on housing. Well, thank you. We're now going to turn to Ryan Baumtrog from Minnesota Housing to give us an update on the governor's position on housing. Ryan, I did see you. Hey, Ryan.
Hey, good morning, Libby. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Great. Hi, everybody. My name is Ryan Baumtrog. I'm Assistant Commissioner for Policy and Community Development at Minnesota Housing. Thanks, Libby, for a little time, and happy to follow up on our great housing chairs. I mean, I'll just acknowledge the agency is thrilled to have the chairs that we have that fight in their caucus for more resources and fight for more housing, because we all on this call know that we need more housing. So similar to the chairs, I think we are big fans of the House position in terms of 75 million in one-time resources and debt service to support 100 million in housing infrastructure bonds. the agency receives, less than 0.5% of the state's general fund resources to do work across the whole continuum, everything from the Family Homelessness Prevention and Assistance Program to down payment assistance. And many, and actually all of the agency's core programs are significantly underfunded. Every RFP we go through, we receive across all of the programs, whether it be homeownership, rental development for new construction, preservation, for housing stability resources, and rental assistance programs. All of them are oversubscribed every time we do an RFP. And so we know we need more. And so we're really hopeful that the global negotiations will put housing, keep it as prioritized as it is in the House. And there really isn't amongst our core programs a wrong program to pick. So the agency is really supportive of where the House and Senate have aligned their resources amongst the FHPAP program, Greater Minnesota programs that need infrastructure resources, but also development resources to build new homes in Greater Minnesota, to down payment assistance. I mean, we just need more. And the agency, as many of you know, has been working through all of the big one-time resources that we got in 2023, and we are effectively out of development resources for the agency's core programs. We have awarded and committed over 95% of the resources for our main programs. And so we need more resources like housing infrastructure bonds to meet the needs all across the state and to select more projects for RFPs that are open as we speak. So we are really thrilled. I'll just say the proposal that gets us really excited is the housing infrastructure bonds and $100 million in the House. This administration has requested from the legislature over $1 billion for housing infrastructure bonds, and the legislature has only authorized just over $500 million, 500 million. So we are excited that maybe this is a session where the legislature catches up on the leadership that this administration has had in previous years on housing infrastructure bonds and continues to just give us the development resources that then we can award to projects for single family rental development, as well as manufactured housing. So we're ready. We're working with both all of our housing chairs on as we head into these last 3 weeks. We are also getting into more conversations around some of the recent policy changes, Libby, that they talked about getting added to the bill. And so we are working very closely with the chairs on the changes to the agency scoring system and the proposal that would put additional rent restrictions on LIHTC projects. So we will be working closely with them so that if those continue to move forward, that they are at least legal, that they can be implemented, and they don't create further challenges in doing all of the work that people on this call do. Affordable housing is really hard, and we want to make sure we end up with legislation and changes that help the work and don't make things harder for developers and property owners all across the state. So happy to share any more if there's any questions, but really appreciate the time this morning, Libby.
Yeah, so Ryan, I'm going to more explicitly ask you questions that I asked the chairs. We'll start with the amendment around low-income housing tax credit projects that is now in the Senate omnibus bill. Does the agency have a position on that amendment?
Yeah, we completely understand the pressures that many renters are facing, especially seniors on a fixed income, when their rents get increased dramatically and the resources that they have to pay rent and other things don't increase. So we're extremely sympathetic to seniors and other families that get huge rent increases and they don't have the income to pay those increases. On the other hand, we also share what Chair Port mentioned is a concern that property owners are also struggling to pay their bills and maintain property stability and meet the needs of those properties. And so right now we have some concerns about the language as it's currently written. We had worked with the authors and legislators last year on some language, some technical assistance we provided from the agency where there was a more narrow focused solution on senior properties. So this is something that we will provide technical assistance and some work. I think as currently written, we do have some concerns because it would take effect immediately. There's just a whole host of questions and considerations and concerns that we have as it's currently written.
Thanks, Ryan. So can you explain for those of us on the call, when the agency provides technical assistance to an author to improve language on a bill, does that inherently mean you are supportive of something, or can you just speak to that process?
Yeah, for sure. We, we put together the governor's budget and policy recommendations starting in the fall ahead of the legislative session. So often there are issues that don't get flagged in time for that process or don't get identified or really lifted up as priorities by either stakeholders or legislators until sometime during session. And so if we don't have an official position on it, because it's not in the governor's budget or policy bill, then what we do is work with authors and stakeholders on language so that even if we don't support it or don't oppose it, but we want to make sure that the language is feasible, that it takes care of any legal concerns. So technical assistance is something we do every session on various proposals. That isn't meant to mean we support it or oppose it. It just means ultimately we want to just make sure that what gets passed can be implemented and it doesn't create unintended consequences from our seat.
Oh, that's very helpful. Are you providing technical assistance on the land use and zoning amendment that the House included in its bill? Can you speak to the agency's position and your thoughts on that provision?
Yeah, we are. That is something we will be working with. We met briefly with Chair Howard yesterday, and I think we'll meet with him later today. Currently, as written, we do have some questions about it in terms of its applicability. We want to understand really kind of the impact that it could have on projects, particularly in greater Minnesota. And then there's, the feasibility timing things. Right now it would, unless, it gets modified right now, it in theory would take effect now and it would impact scoring that's already set in place, and developers and communities are already putting forward projects for our current RFP. So there's a timing consideration too, that we don't want to stall things, slow things down, or create confusion for our RFP processes that are well underway. And we know developers are currently working on applications as we speak. So we're definitely providing some technical assistance on that provision as it moves forward through the House.
There's several provisions in the Senate and the House bills speaking to stabilizing the affordable housing industry. There's a requirement that MHFA would convene city and counties that are most impacted by housing cost burden to think through strategies for how to kind of like working together, not so siloed in how you address those deficits in those communities. Then there's also requirements that the agency has to put together a framework. There's another requirement on annual reporting. Can you speak to the agency's position on some of those policy provisions in the bills?
Yeah, for sure. By and large, the considerations there working around what can we do to help stabilize properties? What can we do to help bring outside resources that the agency doesn't control, like the local housing aid, to help stabilize properties? Like, what can we do to convene partners? Like, we are all in on those types of things at the agency. We know that properties and different portfolios are having challenges, and so we welcome some of the most of the recommendations in that legislation specifically. I think we have some thoughts on particularly the report that's in the House, the report language that's in the House. The Senate made some changes to the report language that would require us to kind of report on the agencies, the properties that are in the agency's portfolios, about how they are doing financially. That works for us. Anything that requires us to kind of survey and get data from the hunt over 100,000 properties where the agency doesn't have a connection with for data, we have some concerns. So I think we can figure out a path on the report language. And then on the policy framework, I think we also have we are supportive of a lot of things that framework would require. I think we have some questions about the timing of it, and maybe some potential costs associated with putting that together. So we'll be working with stakeholders and the chairs to help kind of straighten those out. But generally, pretty supportive of all those positions.
So Ryan, I have you on longer than I told you, but I have one more question for you.
Yeah, it's okay,
If you're
Libby.
with that.
Yeah.
So you talked about the agency is excited about the House's position with 100 million in housing infrastructure bonds. You are out of a significant amount of development resources as compared to the last biennium. But the governor did not include housing infrastructure bonds in his budget or his revised budget when the February forecast was released. So as the agency is closest to the governor, how do we get the governor to support 100 million in housing infrastructure bonds? Because at the end of the day, it's the governor and the House and Senate leadership that hash out this global agreement based on an understanding of where we are with the budget and how much we can spend to balance the budget. Is it pulling at the governor's heartstrings that, if we don't preserve the housing stock that we have, it has the potential to displace households? If we don't build more housing, then, we're continuing to put pressure on those existing units. Is it an economic case, right? That it's going to create X number of jobs. A lot of focus on the bonding bill is about the jobs that are created. And so I'm curious, as any advice you have for all of us as we're reaching out to the governor and pleading with him to support the House's position, what some of the messaging you think would be most effective?
Yeah, Libby, at the end of the day, I don't think this administration and I won't speak for the governor. Learned very early in my job, never speak for the governor. But what I would say is our contacts at the governor's office, they know how important housing infrastructure bonds are. The only reason really it wasn't in the governor's bonding bill this year was because we got the $50 million last year, and we were the only thing in the governor's bonding recommendation last year to get passed. So that's the only reason that it's not in there. So this administration supports housing infrastructure bonds. And as I mentioned already, I mean, this administration has requested $1 billion of housing infrastructure bonds, and the legislature over that time period has authorized just over $500 million. So I don't think you need to do as much convincing. I think the biggest issue is the global targets in general. I mean, housing in the House turned out really well and better than a lot of positions, but I know many people on this call are watching what's happening in the Health and Human Services Committee, where there are real budget reductions. So in some ways, it's less about convincing on housing, but making sure it's a priority amongst the wide range of priorities that this administration needs to consider amongst a more difficult budget environment than they've had for a long time. So I think it's reaching out to the governor and the governor's office, but I also think you need to reassure the House leaders and the Senate leaders that housing's needed. I don't know that it's just kind of a focus on the governor. I think it's got to be at all three.
Well, thank you, Ryan. We really appreciate your time with us this morning.
Yeah, thanks, Libby. Appreciate it.
So, Brian, my colleague, I'm wondering if you can pull up the slide deck again. I will do a quick overview of some of the details of what's in both the House and Senate positions. Next slide, please, Brian. Brian, can you go to the next one?
Yeah, 1 second.
Go back. So high level, again, we're in different positions in each of the three bodies that are going to come together and negotiate a global budget target. MHP has been actively asking people to reach out to the governor and reach out to House and Senate leadership to support the House's position. We're going to continue to do that all through the end of session. Certainly, we're grateful that nobody proposed any cuts. As Brian mentioned, there are there are committees that do have budget cuts proposed. Housing is not one of them, but certainly we feel like going back to 0 or 3 million is really going backwards for housing. Next slide, Brian. So the Senate, Senator Port did mention this, but there's 10 million for the Family Homeless Prevention and Assistance Program. Now, Senator Port did not have a $10 million target. What she has done is transfer money out of a program that isn't spent, and she moves that to the Family Homeless Prevention and Assistance Program in anticipation for higher level of needs for FHPAP. And then she spends $2 million in the Greater Minnesota Housing Infrastructure Grant Program and $2 million in first generation down payment assistance. Next slide. So these are just some select Senate policy. There's more, but I grabbed kind of the headliners. We talked about the rent increases or the rent control calculations on all LIHTC projects. So that is in the Senate omnibus bill. We are certainly going to be tracking that and seeing, what is the status as it goes through conference committee. We heard all chairs express their concerns and the agency. So I'm not terribly optimistic that will make its way across the finish line, but we'll certainly be engaging with the chairs on that issue. Establishing an insurance task force. This is something that many housing providers have been talking about. Single family, multifamily, the cost of insuring properties has escalated dramatically. And so looking at what can be done to address those increasing year-over-year costs. The Senate adds sub-allocators to the wage theft prevention and the use of responsible contractor language that they passed last biennium. So that would impact cities like Minneapolis and St. Paul that are sub-allocators of the low-income housing tax credits. We talked a little bit about the stabilization, those annual reports and the convening of partners and things like that. That's in both the House and the Senate bill. Some language differences that they'll have to work out in conference committee, but that shows up again in the House. It codifies the first generation home buyer assistance program. This is a program that's administered through Midwest Minnesota CDC. That was a new program in 2023, and so this would make it an ongoing permanent program. There's language, and this is really considered technical, but important, I know, for a lot of folks on this call. So the Local Housing Trust Fund, state and matching funds that the agency is going to award, this would impact those funds. So the funds would have to be spent within 5 years, and that's really to match other programs at Minnesota Housing. Currently, it was 7 years in statute, but again, this is just to match other programs, and it's a technical amendment. The bill also waives state housing tax credit income requirements when the state housing tax credit is paired with the Greater Minnesota Workforce Development Program, because that is a market rate program, and it's just to allow developers to have greater certainty when they apply for either of those programs that they can then match them up together. Next slide, please, Brian. So the House budget, 75 million. Here's the way that they break that down: 30 million to the Family Homeless Prevention and Assistance Program. There's a 450,000 per year ongoing to FHPAP. This is a transfer of money, something that happened last year, and they didn't specify what program it would go to, so it's just sort of been sitting there, and so it's going to be transferred over to FHPAP. And then 20 million for the Greater Minnesota Housing Infrastructure Grant Program, 10 million for the Challenge Fund Program, 10 million for the Greater Minnesota Workforce Development Grant Program, 3 million workforce and affordable home ownership development, and 2 million for manufactured home park infrastructure grants. Next slide, Brian. And then there's a few like task force, and Brian, next slide, please. So there's 500,000 for the statewide tenant education and hotline. And then the House proposes an accessible housing task force to really look at the needs of people with disabilities here in the state of Minnesota in both accessing housing as well as what are the available housing options. And so there's $150,000 for that task force, and then another $100,000 to implement the stabilizing strategies. Next slide. So I've just selected the House policies that are different than the Senate. The House does not include the changes to LIHTC and how rent increases are calculated. And it does include that land use zoning, the prioritization of competitive development program awards that Howard and Igo spoke to. Next slide, Brian. So the next steps, next, the House will take up their housing omnibus bill on the House floor. There will likely be amendments, some of which will be adopted and some of which will be kind of more for the purposes of sparking discussion amongst colleagues. We see that annually. So we haven't seen any of those amendments drafted, don't know what they look like, but so we do anticipate some changes. Oftentimes there's a technical amendment or two. Sometimes there's something substantive, so we'll be on the lookout for that. Once the House passes the housing bill, because the House and Senate are apart on budget and policy, they will conference committee those reports. So that's going to be the time when Igo, Howard, and Port, as well as the agency, are in the room together, talking through their differences, figuring out really where they're similar. And that's going to be the hardest work comes when a new budget target is announced. And so the governor and leadership in the House and Senate will be working over the course of the next days and weeks, and it could drag out depending on how far apart they are and just how negotiation is going. But once that global budget target is announced, they will do the tough work of figuring out how to spend that target. If it's 75 million, that work is easier. If it's 0 or 3 million, well, it's kind of easy to spend almost no money, but if there's something, around like 25 million, they'll certainly have to spend a lot of time discussing how do they address their priorities. But I think we heard from both the Senate and the House that they're interested in balancing housing stability programs with some brick and mortar development programs. So those are the next steps. Look from MHP for action alerts. We are also, this will be coming out later today. We are hoping to fill the gallery next Tuesday when the House bill is up on the floor as a demonstration to House leadership, as well as to the governor and to the Senate, the support for the House's position on housing, as well as we're planning a press conference for next Tuesday. So look out for an email from us, packing that room, that gallery, when that debate is happening it's both exciting and something to be a part of, as well as it really is a show of force for housing. And we hope as a way to influence lawmakers as they think about those budget targets. So thank you all for joining us this morning. You saw my email contact up there. Feel free to reach out to me with any questions and any ways in which you would hope to engage with MHP as we work through these next few weeks of session. So thank you, everyone.